So, Mr. Johnston, we are ready to start our interview. If you are ready as well.
I'm ready.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you for joining us for that interview, and I would like to just to tell some brief information for those who will be watching this interview afterwards. That Ukrainian League of Industrials and Entrepreneurs has been approved as observer organization in business at OECD, and Mr. Johnson is a chairman of the executive board in business at OECD. So we are thankful for such decision of the executive board, and we would like to cover more about the role of your organization and cooperation with OECD, and also the new opportunities for our Ukrainian industrials, for our business that will be possible with this status of observer. So, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to add that joining me on this call is Hani Rosenbaum, who is the Executive Director of Business at OECD, or as we sometimes refer to it as BIAC. It's the acronym for Business and Industrial Advisory Committee to the OECD. And I'll describe in a little more detail what BIAC actually does in a moment. But first, I want to say thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak with you and to give you a better feeling for this wonderful step we've taken in having ULIE, or the Ukrainian League of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, join BIAC as an observer. It's a remarkably positive first step, and we really do look forward to working with ULIE and its member companies as we progress towards what I think, and I certainly pray, will be a very positive future and relationship. We also want to express in this, and I know that there are many people from Ukraine watching, that BIAC is very, very strongly supportive of the Ukrainian effort, the people, and we will do our best to reach a successful outcome in this horrible conflict that you're undergoing right now. What is business at OECD or BIAC? It's a formally established advisory committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And as most of you know, the OECD is the collection of member states that are essentially market-driven economies that are democracies. So it's right off the bat for ULIE to become an observer to our advisory committee to the OECD is a strong indication of how Ukraine and how Ukrainian business sees itself in the world. That is, these are businesses that are market-based, they are pro-competitive, and these are businesses that want to participate in the strengthening of a democracy, which is fundamentally important to the OECD standards. BIAC has been serving in this formal role and as an advisory committee to the OECD for 60 years now, a little over 60 years. We just celebrated our 60th anniversary in Paris, and we're looking forward to 60 more years of being a very trusted partner. And as you can imagine, in today's world, trust is essential. And over 60 years, BIAC has served in this really important private sector role as an advisor to the OECD. When you look around the world and you look at the various international organizations that currently make up our world order, there are very, very few examples of a private sector organization such as ours having this formal advisory role in the international organization. So it's a very unique status, and I think ULIE should be very proud and frankly very excited about the participation that it can have in working with us, and therefore working within the process of the OECD. BIAC represents our members are international national business organizations, much like ULIE. And in that context, we therefore have serve as the voice literally for 7 million enterprises worldwide. And now Ukrainian business through ULIE has a part of this forum, this very important forum. We have 28 different policy committees in which ULIE members will be able to participate and contribute to what we then suggest as and recommend to the OECD in various topics that involve business, whether it's on anti-corruption, best practices in promoting foreign direct investment, a variety of policy issues such as climate change. These are all topics that obviously for Ukrainian business are going to be extremely important going forward once this conflict is resolved. I think that probably the most significant part of why this is beneficial to ULIE is the fact that Ukrainian business will now have a voice in international business dialogue. And the isolation that otherwise some would prefer to see Ukrainian business suffer will no longer be the case. So I think that's a very significant step forward. This is a forum, BIAC is a forum in which all international business really cooperates and collaborates and shares its views. So in its observer status, ULIE and its member companies will be able to participate in conversations with colleagues and counterparts around the world, whether it's in Japan, Costa Rica, Hungary, Germany, the United Kingdom, and certainly the United States. So I think that that's a really important element of what ULIE should be thinking about as it begins to participate as an observer with BIAC. Hani, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it was a perfect summary, Rick. Let me just also underline again how delighted we are to have ULIE in our membership as an observer. Svetlana and I, we've been in touch many, many times, and we'd just like to add that in addition to your active participation in the policy group, we'd also be very pleased to have a direct dialogue with you to see how we can bring the importance of the challenges and opportunities for Ukrainian business to the attention of the OECD, as the OECD is very actively involved in a program to support Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hani. And yeah, I agree with you, Mr. Johnston, that our organization will have great opportunities, especially in such topics as decarbonization, modernization of Ukrainian economy, and so on, because as far as you know, there is Ukraine reconstruction plan which was presented in Lugano, and now many countries working on it closely with Ukraine. So Ukrainian business and exporters, they are highly interested in cooperation with international colleagues. So BIAC, as a voice of international business, has a great impact on the policy of the OECD. So I would like to ask you, what has been the relationship between the OECD and Ukraine recently, and what types of projects, like common projects, shall we wait for, like next year, let's say? So, your opinion.
Well, as you've observed, Ukraine has had a relationship with the OECD and has had discussions since, actually, from what I understand it, 1991. So this is, I think we're experiencing an evolutionary process in which gradually, of course, and now on perhaps a more accelerated basis, the Ukrainian government as well as the Ukrainian business community will be coming closer and closer in dialogue with the OECD. But I think in order to answer your question with some detail, I'm going to ask Hani to jump in here and provide a little bit more perspective on the OECD working relationship with Ukraine.
Okay, thank you, Rick, and happy to do so. As Rick mentioned, the OECD has had an active cooperation with Ukraine since the 1990s already. Then, of course, a key milestone going forward was in 2014, when there was a formal memorandum of understanding, which led to some concrete action plan in cooperation with the OECD. I'd just like to mention 3 topics. One is anti-corruption, one is governance and rule of law, and then the general investment and business climate, where there was an active dialogue with Ukraine since then. Then, of course, as we all know, following the unprovoked and illegal war against Ukraine by Russia, Russia and Belarus were immediately suspended from further discussions with the OECD. And the OECD has launched a very active action plan to work even more actively together with Ukraine going forward to identify priorities for the cooperation to create the right framework for the recovery and for business to play its contribution going forward. And then, as you know, there have been recent discussions on Ukraine applying for OECD membership in the OECD. There is now an initial dialogue with Ukraine going on. We are very hopeful that the dialogue will proceed. And in the meantime, from the business community side, we very much support this dialogue. We would like to make sure that the dialogue between Ukraine and the OECD is supported by arguments from the business community on the real challenges and opportunities that you face. And that's why we very much appreciate the dialogue that we have with ULIE.
Thank you. So Ukraine has formally applied for OECD membership, and you already mentioned that. I would like to ask you your opinion. What about the accession process will be, and maybe some terms you can predict it. Will it be quickly, very soon, or we should wait this for some months?
Well, I think the answer to that is probably along the lines of what you just suggested, which is it's going to take a while. The accession process is a very thorough, multi-year process. But I think that it may be a bit disappointing to hear that. On the other hand, I think we need to also recognize that it demonstrates that once a country does become a member of the OECD, it's something to be very proud of, and it's something that has been accomplished. It's not just given to you, so it's earned. And I think that gives the OECD probably its strength. The fact that these member countries have really proven that they are like-minded and that they share the same values as market-based democracies, pursuing transparency, pursuing good governance. In other words, once you become a member of the OECD, that is truly an emblem of success and of we'll call it strong values for freedom, for competition, for the kinds of things that I think Ukraine definitely stands for right now. So it's going to take a while. It'll take many years. And but I think that it's at the end of this road, it will actually help Ukraine come out of the current crisis stronger, with a better, we'll call it a better grasp of what it takes to be a successful and competitive market-based democracy. So it's a process that right now, I know has started at an informal basis. There are conversations right now going on with the Secretariat of the OECD, led by Matthias Cormann, who's the Secretary General. Those informal conversations then, at some point, and it's very, very hard at this point to predict exactly when, but then they will shift into a more formalized preliminary discussion about a Ukrainian accession. Eventually, after those more formalized preliminary discussions take place, if it's deemed useful, because you don't want to start a process that's going to end up in disappointment, but if it's deemed useful and it's deemed worthy of progressing, you then get into formalized conversations about designing what they call the roadmap. And a roadmap is a very, very detailed, we'll call it list of activities that have to be taken, issues that have to be considered in order for the government to be become eligible for OECD membership. We just saw 5 countries at the last ministerial council meeting at the OECD, in which we BEAC participate. But 5 countries were essentially assigned their roadmaps and are moving forward now with the accession talks that I said earlier. These will take like maybe 5 years, quite a while, as is the past experience. Those countries were Brazil, Bulgaria, Croatia, Peru, and Romania. Argentina, and this is interesting to note, was also part of this initial group that was hoping for a roadmap to initiate the roadmap discussions. But Argentina withdrew because it saw that it was not yet ready for that. So it shows you that this is a pretty rigorous process, and it's one that you cannot take lightly. And this is one that is not going to be automatic. Now, I want to underscore the initial point I made. When this process towards accession gets underway, it's a very serious one, and it's not one that you're going to want to lightly pull back from. And it's one in which the Ukrainian government, and very, very importantly, the Ukrainian real economy, the business community of Ukraine, represented by ULIE, are going to have to become extremely dedicated to moving forward, undertaking certain obligations that are going to have to be accepted before accession to the OECD is in order. So it's a very, I think, from what I've experienced in witnessing these accession processes in the past, I think it's a really reforming effort. It's something that I think business, particularly in Ukraine, will find actually quite enlightening and very, very constructive, because it leads to the kinds of acceptance by the host government, in this case, the Ukrainian government, of standards and procedures, again, transparency, rule of law, the kinds of things that are going to be essential for Ukrainian business to thrive in a free market environment.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some obligations which should be taken by our authorities, government, and business as well. But I would like you to specify more about obligations for business. What business can do right now on this process, on this road, except like standards, rules, obtaining those rules. What else from your experience, from your recommendations?
Well, there are over 250 OECD legal instruments that will have to be examined by the Ukrainian government, obviously in partnership with the OECD. And this is where BIAC, to answer your question, this is where BIAC is really helpful for Ukrainian business, because BIAC serves obviously as an experienced guide for businesses and business groups such as ULIE in determining what role they can play in the accession process. Obviously, when you're talking about 250 legal instruments, as well as a number of other, we'll call it programs and practices that the OECD requires of its members. And again, I obviously I don't want to list all of them by name, but when you're talking about legal instruments and policies and practices that essentially support transparency, the rule of law, sanctity of contract, democratic values, this is a very the words like-minded comes up constantly in these talks about OECD membership. And the whole point is being, this is a group of countries and governments that agree on certain general principles of governance, as well as of a business and an economic environment that promotes competitiveness and transparency. So to answer your question, I think really the fact that ULIE now has become an observer to us at BIAC is probably the best thing that Ukrainian government Ukrainian business can do to provide for us at BIAC to help provide guidance to ULIE in terms of how the business community in Ukraine can work with the Ukrainian government and work with us, working with the OECD. It's like a partnership in terms of helping carry the succession process forward. One thing I'd like to emphasize in this, and I think that it's critical. Of course, you're right now in a state of war in Ukraine. And therefore the governance of the country is obviously geared towards success in this war effort. That is not a normal peacetime kind of governance. And it's going to be a very difficult process. In my experience, I think if you study the history of countries that try to grow out of a conflict situation, it's going to be a very difficult challenge for the government to shift gears, if you want to call it that, from a wartime style of governance into a peacetime style of governance that then allows for more transparency. The national security element of governance will be revised, and business is going to have to be a part of this dialogue with its government in terms of recreating and possibly strengthening a market-based system that allows for more private sector competition, more transparency in governance. This is a shift that's going to be very difficult, and it's something that I think the OECD, if you look at the history of the OECD, it was formed essentially to help Europe recreate viable, sustainable economies after World War II. Well, this is sort of the same situation. That's why it is so right for Ukraine to become more closely involved with the OECD, and for ULIE to become an observer to BIAC, so that we can all work together to help Ukraine eventually move out of this wartime style of governance into a peacetime style of governance that supports the markets, competition, transparency, and the other things that allow for economies to thrive on a sustainable basis.
I would like just to mention that our Ukrainian League of Industrials are in dialogue with government, of course, every day, and we work closely on what you already said, that we predict for the future how to shift from the wartime economy to like economy of open markets and so on and so on. So we work on this like every day, and I believe that we will succeed very soon in that. Well, the last question for this interview, but not the least, I would like to ask that will Ukrainian League of Industrials automatically become a member of business at OECD after Ukraine becomes OECD member? So can you tell more about the process, let's say?
Well, as I say, I'm a recovering lawyer, meaning when someone asks a question, I'm unfortunately sometimes too straightforward. The answer to your question about whether ULIE automatically becomes a member of BIAC is no, it's not automatic. It requires the approval of our General Assembly, in which the representatives of all of our member national organizations will vote. I can assure you, however, that as we work with you in our history, working with observer organizations that are part of countries that ultimately become members of the OECD, assuming that's the process and how successful it is, there's a very strong likelihood that the General Assembly would accept ULIE as a member of a full formal member of the OECD. I'm sorry, of BIAC. Let me also, I wanted to emphasize something that I think will help, not only in consultation with BIAC, of course, in terms of how ULIE can be a constructive partner in the process, but I would highly recommend you study the experiences of Costa Rica or of Colombia and communicate through us at BIAC with those national business organizations in terms of their experiences, because these are two countries and two organizations that are now formally part of the OECD family. And they're the most recent experiences. So I think they would be very useful samples and examples to look at and study in terms of how did they go through this process. One other thing I'd like to emphasize, though, and that is now under the leadership of Matthias Cormann, the acceptance of countries and governments as members of the OECD is going to be, I think, a bit more rigorous. And I'm being honest with you here. It's going to be, in the past, there was the impression that once you applied for OECD membership and you were given a roadmap, you sort of automatically became a part of the OECD family. I don't think it's going to be like that anymore. I think that there's going to be a bit more of a rigorous process in which the OECD member states are going to be more closely examining, how the applicant's country is complying with or is adopting reforms that will allow that government to show that it is in sync with OECD standards and instruments. So it's something that I think you in business will appreciate. I mean, business goes through this process every day in terms of regulation, compliance with law, et cetera. And in some ways, I think the Ukrainian business community can help the Ukrainian government appreciate and work in this process towards compliance, towards adopting reforms that will obviously benefit the business community, but also help the government in its process towards membership.
That was one of our goals, let's say. So, Mr. Johnston, thank you, and Hani also thank you for joining us for such interview. I hope someday we will meet you in Kyiv, here in Kyiv, when it will be safe for you. So.
We really do very much look forward to working with you and the leadership of ULIE as well as its member companies. Again, really delighted that ULIE is now an observer at BIAC, and we're going to do as much as we possibly can to support our mutual success and prosperity.